He made the offer right after we had the bombing of nuclear facilities in Iran by the United States, and he made the offer to share with us from his perspective. Don, for those of you who do not know him, he is a retired Navy captain, and he also has a PhD in political science and taught at Texas State for many years. And this is an area that's been part of his life experience and part of his study. So I am so glad that he's here today. There's going to be a time for him to be responding to your questions, but I'm going to turn it over to Don. Would you welcome him, please?
Well, first of all, Cole, your phone timed out on me. But I'm glad to have the opportunity to come here today. Like I said, I'm Don Inbody. I spent 28 years in the Navy. I retired as a captain. I got my commission in February of 1979. 1979 was the same year that the Iranian Revolution occurred. As a result of that, my entire 28 years in the Navy was absolutely tied up with the Middle East, one way or the other. I spent, I think I had 8 deployments to the Middle East, either in the Persian Gulf or the Arabian Sea or into Jordan, number of places like that. So I have quite a bit of experience there. The Navy also decided that for whatever reason, well, they asked me these questions. They said, we're going to send you to the Naval Postgraduate School, and what would you like to learn about? And I said, well, I'd like to learn about, this was in 1982, and I said, well, I'd like to learn about either the Soviet Union or Western Europe or the Western Pacific. And they said, fine, you're going to learn about the Middle East. So that's the degree I got there, and then it seems like every other degree after that, I've ended up in some kind of an avenue of dealing with that. My Navy career taught me one thing, and my academic career taught me another, about how to approach issues like this. In the Navy, and some of you who've been in the military may have had to participate in something like this, and then those of you who are lawyers, I had to conduct, during the course of my career, 2 or 3 things that are called a JAG investigation, a Judge Advocate General investigation. And that is, something happened that was bad, and I was required to do an investigation into it. And the way that that methodology works is, the first thing you do is you go out and create a list of called findings of fact. And once you have this list of findings of fact, then from that you create opinions. And each opinion has to be mapped back to specific findings of fact. In other words, it can't be an opinion all by itself. And from those opinions, then you create recommendations. And each recommendation then is tied to specific opinions. Therefore, every recommendation that I came up with to findings of fact. It works well with research too. When I got into academia, I realized that the methodology there was always start with a research question. You don't just dive in. What's the question? What am I trying to answer? Your question. Well, the question today is, we have a Middle East out here with a lot of crisis going on. That, by the way, is the plural of crisis. So it's the endless crises. There's a lot of them. There have been for a long time. Today, we're going to talk about 3 specific things. We're going to talk about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. That's what's been going on in Gaza and a few things around that. We're going to talk about the Israeli-Iranian conflict. Why does Iran have a problem with Israel? We're going to talk about that. And then, in general, a little bit about it is the U.S. involvement in both of those things. So for those of you that have to leave right now, here's the answers to the questions. Okay. World War I messed up everything in the Middle East. Okay, that's an overstatement, but it's not far from the truth. And we'll talk a little bit about what happened as a result of World War I and its impact on the Middle East. There is a tremendous amount of Muslim anger at the West for what they perceive as their lost empire. We'll talk a little bit about that. But that anger is definitely there. There's no question about that. Israel is perceived through most of the Muslim world as a European colony in the Middle East that doesn't belong there. Okay, so that's one of the senses, the feelings in that particular area. And the last two are kind of bald-faced and, again, slight overstatements, but not far from the truth. Nobody cares about the Palestinians, including the Arabs and everybody else, although it seems like they do, but they really don't. And nobody cares about the Jews. Now, those last two statements say an awful lot about why we have those conflicts, because both of them see their existence in the Middle East as an existential problem. It is life-threatening. It is an existence problem for both of them, and they see each other as the antagonists. Now, when you came in, every one of you was given a little card. If you don't have one, we can make sure that you get one. But what that is for, as I'm talking, if you have a question pop into your head, write it down. Because I know what happens. You'll get a question in your head, and then 30 minutes later, when I ask for questions, your brain falls out of your head and lands on the floor, and you can't remember what it was, okay? So just write them down. I will answer as many of those as we have time for at the end. Any that I can't get to, I'm going to collect them all. And if there is sufficient interest, I'll have some follow-on courses like this, and then I can get to answering those specific questions. Okay, but first we're going to do a lightning look at a little bit of geography, just to remind ourselves of what's looking here. Remember I said that World War I messed up everything. Okay, that's a map of what some people call the Middle East. Other people expand the Middle East into Afghanistan and some into North Africa. That's irrelevant to our discussion today. But we're going to talk about this area. Every single border on that map, with the exception of the border between Iran and Iraq, was drawn by either a Frenchman or a British politician. Okay? None of those borders are natural borders. Those borders were all basically drawn at the end of World War I. And the extent of them was controlled by either British or French. That's a slight overstatement, but it's almost true, and it has an awful lot to do with some of the problems that we have there. Now, what is your understanding of the ethnic diversity in the Middle East? Anybody have any thoughts? Muslim, okay, that's religious. What about the ethnic diversity? There's some Kurds there. All right. There's a lot of different ones. I'm not going to go through every one of those colors, but every one of those little different colors is a different ethnic group within the Middle East. It is very diverse. Now, all the yellow that you see over around Saudi Arabia and Syria, those are Arabs, okay? The other ones are not. You'll notice over in Iran, they are not Arab. They're Persian, Tajik. There's a lot of different groups over in there. The green ones are Turkic, which are groups that came out of Central Asia many, many years ago. But the ethnic diversity is a critical piece that you have to remember about the Middle East. Now, what about religious diversity? Yes, somebody said there's Muslims. Yes, there's a lot of Muslims in the Middle East. But that's not everything. There are two major divisions of Islam. There are the Sunnis, which are the majority, and there are the Shia, which is a minority, but they're not the only ones. Now, the light green is what generally would be called Sunni. We're blanking out, guys. Is the Sunnis, which is the majority of them. Is this something I'm doing or something you're doing? Okay. The darker green are the Shia. Now you'll notice over in Iran it's largely Shia. Over in the rest of it is mostly Sunni. That is one of the big divisions and the conflicts in the Middle East that you have to realize. An awful lot of the conflict in the Middle East can be defined by this Sunni-Shia divide. Now, having said that, there are many others in the area there. Now, I'm just going to hone in right on the Levant, which is the word of art for Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, and that area of the coast there. And so you can see that there's a lot of different ones. I'm not going to go down all that list on the side, but you can see that there's, not only are there the Sunni and the Shia, but there's all these other little divisions that are in there, all of which matter to their self-identity and who they perceive as their enemy and who they perceive as their friend. Now, one of the things that I am not going to do today is put my opinion into what I think is a good thing or a bad thing, or good policy or bad policy. I'm going to try to lay out a finding of facts, and you then can use those to ask further questions and come to some of your own conclusions. But I'm going to lay out, I'm kind of in a problem identification mode today. I'm going to kind of lay out what the problem is. Now, at my heart, I'm an historian. We're going to go through a few thousand years of history in about 2 minutes, okay? A history of the Middle East. What you're looking at on the map, the green parts up there, is the Ottoman Empire at its height in about the year 1683, how it had spread. The Ottoman Empire was the Muslim empire. This is the empire that today, when I said that there's a lot of anger at the loss of the Muslim empire, this is the empire that they dream about. They had that they were going to control the world, and this was the world that they had it. Now, you can flip down through that. The pre-Christian era, there was the Mesopotamia and Assyria, which were over even further off the map there. The various biblical traditions and histories that we know about, that we read about in the Bible. The Greek Empire, the Roman Empire through about the 1st century BC. Then the Christian influences after Constantine in the 4th century. Islam hit in about the 6th century when Muhammad was alive, and they spread throughout. Then we ended up with the Islamic Empire, and they had taken control of Jerusalem, which then subsequently triggered the Crusades of the European Christians attempting to take back Jerusalem. There were battles back and forth throughout there for a couple of centuries. Eventually, in 1453, the Muslim Empire conquered Constantinople, which is today what city? Istanbul. And that kind of caused the collapse of the Christian empires in this particular part of the world. And then the Ottoman Empire then from the 13th through the 20th centuries. So it was the longest. It was this long particular thing. Now, in 1900, we're going to jump forward now, this is what the world looked like in that area. The Ottoman Empire, the Turkish Empire, if you will. Persia over to the right. Persia is the old name for Iran. You can see where Russia was. You'll notice that there's no Saudi Arabia at that particular time. There was this emirate down here in the Arabian Peninsula. Saudi Arabia hadn't gotten formed yet. Egypt was nominally under Ottoman control, but in reality, the British owned it and controlled it. So there's an awful lot of European involvement in the area. Jump forward to right after World War I, and now we see there's no more Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire has collapsed as a result of World War I. Turkey is what's left over. The British have taken over this whole section they've expanded from British Egypt through what is called Palestine. They had a mandate in that particular area, and Iraq. The French are taking over what is to become Syria and Lebanon. Persia is still out there. You'll notice the Saudi Emirate of the Nejd. Well, that's the Saudi Arabia is just beginning to get formed. King Abdulaziz of the Saud family has now started to capture that particular area. All of that was captured by warfare. Over on the left side over there of the Arabian Peninsula, you see the Kingdom of Hijaz. That's the beginnings of the Jordanian kings and some of the others in there. Now, jump forward to 1940, at the beginning of the beginning years of World War II. The map is starting to look a little bit more like it does today. You'll notice that we still have Egypt now, which is still under British control, but there is still there's an Egyptian king there. Palestine is there. It's still under a British mandate. There is no state of Israel. There is no state of Israel. We'll talk more about how that came about here in just a few minutes. Iraq has been formed separately. There is a king in Iraq at that particular time. There's a king in Syria. Saudi Arabia has formed. Saudi Arabia pushed up until it ran into who? The British. So that's why I say those borders have been controlled by British and French. The Saudis expanded until they hit British control and they couldn't go any further. Now, 1950, we're after World War II now. We now have a state of Israel. We'll talk a little bit about that. There's a state of Jordan, Syria, Iraq, all of that. Now, that map looks a little more familiar. It looks a little bit more like what it does today. There are some slight differences, but that's pretty much what has happened at that. Now, let's jump to Israel. How long has there actually been a state of Israel? Well, this is the broad history, okay? Now, if you want to get into the really details and stuff, I know Pastor Stephen has a course that he teaches where he can go into a lot of this detail of going through there. I'm going to do the lightning version of it here. So we know about the kingdom of Israel and Judah back maybe as early as the 11th century BC. Certainly since 900 BC, there was a kingdom of Israel and Judah. It split into those two kingdoms, the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, and they were both ultimately destroyed by those various attacks. You can read the biblical, the scriptural references to those actually in there. But those were actually destroyed, and then they began what was referred to as the Babylonian exile, where the leaders and the intelligentsia of Israel then were taken away, taken into Babylon. The return to Israel occurred in 538, and then we had a re-rise of a state-like event, a state-like entity of Israel that we read about in the Bible. The Roman conquest, which occurred in the first century, ultimately the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 AD, which led to the Jewish diaspora, which ended anything that looked like Israel at all in that particular area. Now, there is no Palestine in the area. Now, the word Palestine comes from originally the Philistines. The Philistines owned the area of the coast along the Mediterranean there. And so the word Palestine kind of comes from that word Philistine. And so it was a description of both an area and the people who lived in that area. They were predominantly Arab ethnically. And today, of course, predominantly Muslim, but not exclusively. I'm going to talk a little bit about this Zionism. Zionism is an extremely controversial subject. It is seen as a unifying event in getting people to come to the Holy Land, get Jews to come back for a Jewish state. It is, on the other side, seen as a violently racist event to create this thing. So it creates a lot of it. So Zionism is both used as a positive term in support of Israel. It is used as a negative term if you're Palestinian or some Arabs and all. So it can do that. Then we have modern Israel since 1948. Now, Jerusalem is at the center of the whole thing. Now, why? Well, we obviously know that Jerusalem was important to the Jews. We read about that in our Bible stories all the time. We know that it is important to the Christians. We read about that in our Bible stories all the time. Why is it important? Yes?
Because Muhammad ascended to heaven there.
That's right. Toward the end of Muhammad's life, according to the legends, according to the stories, Muhammad was magically transported from Medina in what is now Saudi Arabia, to Jerusalem, to the mountain there, upon which today is the Dome of the Rock. That's that golden dome. That's the mosque that's on the Dome of the Rock right now. He was magically transported there one night, ascended into heaven, had discussions with God and Moses and a few of the others, and then was magically then transported back to Medina. So that is the connection. Jerusalem is seen as the third most holy site in Islam, after Mecca, Medina, and then Jerusalem. This is a term that also has a great effect on Jewish politics and why we have so much other conflict in the area between the Jews and the Palestinians, the Jews and the Arabs. The term Eretz Israel, it translates roughly to the land of Israel. What is the land of Israel? How was it defined? Well, according to Orthodox Jews, it was defined by God in the Bible. Now, in Genesis 15, it was just kind of the area given to Abraham when he came to the area. It was kind of undefined specifically, but that was what it was. By the time you get to Exodus, there is a description in there that basically says it's from the Red Sea to the Sea of the Philistines, which is the Mediterranean, to the river, the Euphrates River. Well, that's a mighty massive area. If you look at the map on the bottom right there, you see that area blanked out, that if you take that literally, that is the land of Israel. The area up the top, though, is where, according to the traditions of the Jews, were the lands that the colored ones in there were the lands given to the various tribes, the various 12 tribes of Israel, which is a little bit more restrained, but is still kind of defined as the land of Israel. Now, why does that matter? Right now, we know that on the west bank of the Jordan, there's a lot of Jewish settlements in the West Bank, which is not technically part of Israel, but it has been occupied by them. What was the justification for that? The justification for it is God gave us the land. Who are we to say no to God? That has caused an awful lot of the separation there. Now, under Jewish law, that has no legal authority, but it certainly has spiritual authority and makes it very difficult for the governments to stop those settlements on the West Bank, which is Palestinian territory today, which causes an awful lot of the strife. Zionism. I mentioned in the year 70 AD, the Jewish diaspora began, where they were kicked out of Israel. They scattered throughout Europe, spread through an awful lot of part of the Europe. By the 19th century, the 1800s, there was an awful lot of anti-Jewish pogroms going on, particularly in Eastern Europe. Those of you who have watched a number of those shows know that there was an awful lot of that going on in Eastern Europe, all over Europe, but it was heavily bad in Eastern Europe. At that time, a number of Jews had been going on for a few hundred years, but by 1890, this man named Theodor Herzl, who was Romanian, began to come up with this idea of formalizing the idea of the return to Israel, a Jewish homeland in Palestine. And so this norm of Zionism, the return to there, his idea was to strive to create for the Jewish people, a home in Palestine secured by public law. He was a very good developer. He was very good at raising money. He managed to raise a whole lot of money and began at about that time throughout the first half of the 20th century of Jews going to Palestine and buying up land from the existing owners in that particular area. And so as a result of that, from about the 50 years, from 1890 through about 1940, a lot of Jews were leaving Europe and traveling to Israel to buy land, to set up farms, to set up businesses. And so the Jewish population in Palestine began growing. Now remember, at this time, Palestine was controlled by the British, and the British were not having a problem with that. They were allowing them to come in. Now, I mentioned once before that World War I screwed up everything. Again, a slight overstatement, but if you remember that, it has an awful lot of effect. There's a classic book that I got about 30 or 40 years ago, which I still keep on my shelf. And if you'll all remember, what was the classic phrase that Woodrow Wilson gave to World War I, the war to end all wars? Well, the title of the book was A Peace to End All Peace, which is very much true about what happened because of the way the peace was drawn up in that area, has a great effect on why we have problems there today. Great Britain controlled Egypt since about 1882, yes, nominally under the Ottomans, but the British were effectively in control. The Ottomans decided to side with Germany in World War I. So as a result, then the British had to, or decided to attack up into the Ottoman area, which the Ottomans controlled Palestine. By about 1916, the British had moved up into Palestine and were attacking Jerusalem. They got the Arabs in the area to begin to create what they called the Arab Revolt, that the Arabs to revolt against the Ottomans. There were these vague, not specific, but vague promises that at the end of World War I, that the Arabs would have some autonomy in the area to include Jerusalem. This is the era of Lawrence of Arabia. That's T.E. Lawrence up there in the upper right, and the lower right, T.E. Lawrence, Lawrence of Arabia. The guy in the upper left is a guy named Hussein. If you remember that earlier map I showed you of the kingdom of the Hijaz, he was the Sharif, the head guy of that particular community. He was the man that the British went after to convince to join into the Arab Revolt. His son, the guy in the front, in the bottom left photo there, T.E. Lawrence is on his left shoulder there. He ended up being the king of Iraq, or the king of Syria, but he was one of the guys who kind of led that particular revolt. So as a result, we had these vague British promises to the Arabs for autonomy following the war. Ultimately, the British defeated the Ottomans in the area. But going on at exactly the same time, a British politician, military guy, and a French politician, military guy, Sykes and Picot, got together under orders from their governments. What is the Middle East going to look like following World War I? And what they did was they divided up the area, the Sykes-Picot Agreement. And here is kind of what they did. There was going to be this British control and influence for what is now Jordan and Iraq. There's going to be French control or influence in what is now Syria, Lebanon, and even into parts of Turkey. They gave the Russians some part. Remember, in World War I, the Russians were sort of allied with the Allies. And then there was some Italian control given up in that particular area. The area of Palestine, which included Jerusalem, was supposed to be under international control, but in reality was under British control. Now, to make things even more confusing, the Prime Minister of Britain at that time, Balfour, came out with the Balfour Declaration, which says, it is the policy of the British government that there would be promised a home for the Jewish people in Palestine. So now we have these vague promises to the Arabs for autonomy in the area, and now we have a British policy of a Jewish homeland in that particular area. So we're starting to see some cross purposes here. World War II is over. Franklin Roosevelt, who you see up there, had just gone to the Yalta Conference to meet with Stalin and Churchill to figure out the end of the war. This is in February of 1945, not long before FDR died. On his way back, he stopped off in the Red Sea and had a meeting with King Abdulaziz Al Saud. That is the guy that Saudi Arabia is named after. It's the only country in the world that's named after a family. They were having a discussion at that time about what was going to be like in Palestine at the end of the war. And King Abdulaziz is saying, well, we Arabs control the area, we should be our area. FDR was saying, well, what do you think about a Jewish homeland? The British have said that they would want a Jewish homeland. We think the Jews were badly treated in World War II. We think this is a good thing. King Abdulaziz led to him. He says, well, who was it that was giving the Jews such a bad time in World War II? They said it was the Germans. He says, well, why don't you give them Bavaria? Okay? And the conversation ended right after that. Israel. At the end of World War II, Israel was kind of under international control and actually nominally under the British. They came up with the UN was just being formed, and they decided that they were going to partition the area to create a Jewish homeland and an Arab homeland. Simultaneous with this, they were deciding what to do with India. India was a British colony, and they were going to divide up India at the same time, and they did the same kind of thing, a partition where largely Hindu, largely Muslim, and that led to the creation of India and Pakistan out of what was the British India, which led to a no number of conflicts that we have over there now because of somewhat arbitrary boundaries. That's what happened here. The yellow areas that you see on the left map were the areas that were going to be promised as an Arab state. The gray ones in that left map then were the areas that were going to be a proposed Jewish state. The pink blob right in the middle was Palestine, or was Jerusalem, and was going to be this internationally controlled city, controlled by the UN, administered by the UN. That proposal never got off the ground because very quickly after that, in 1948, the Arab armies invaded from Egypt, from Jordan, from Syria, from Lebanon, and started the 1948 war. Very quickly after that, the Jewish armies, which were well supplied at that particular time, if you'll remember, the area had been filled with military equipment following World War II. The Jews in the area had managed to get their hands on an awful lot of that. In fact, there was a Jewish brigade that had been formed in the Middle East that fought against Rommel in North Africa. There was a lot of highly trained individuals. There were a number of individuals who had fought elsewhere in World War II who came to Jerusalem. There was a heavy black market in military equipment coming into the area following World War II with all of this excess military gear laying around the world, and there were people with a lot of money who were happy to buy that up and ship it to Israel. The Israeli armies then counterattacked, which then led to the creation of the modern boundaries of Israel. Now, I want to talk a little bit about Israeli politics. Now, this is pure political science, and trust me, it matters in this particular case. Israel is a parliamentary democracy. It is controlled by a 120-seat parliament known as the Knesset. How do you get, it has a president who is the head of state and a prime minister who is head of government, much like Britain has a king who is the head of state and a prime minister is head of government. In the United States, we combine head of state and head of government into a single person, the president. That's just different ways of doing business. Over there, and Benjamin Netanyahu is the prime minister. In reality, the head of government in most of these areas that have parliamentary things is, in fact, the real political power. Now, the Knesset, as I said, is 120 seats. It is a representative, it is a proportional government. The way they do it is if your political party can get up to 3.5% of the popular vote, you rate a seat in the Knesset. As a result, right now, there are 13 political parties that have seats in the Knesset in Israel as of right now. Some of them have as few as 1 seat, and some have more. None of them has a majority. So as a result, right now, there are the 13 parties that hold seats. 7 of those parties are in the government, 6 are in opposition. How do you form a government under a parliamentary system? Somebody has to pull together a coalition of various political parties who agree that they will be in the government, And in this particular case, Benjamin Netanyahu, who happens to be conservative on the right side of the political spectrum, formed a group of more conservative parties to create a majority government. It is a bare majority, but it is a majority government. Now, what's the political impact of that, and why does it matter? Because some of those conservative political parties are those extreme right-wing, ultra-Orthodox Jewish groups who believe in the Eretz Israel, the land of Israel, who believe that they have to have settlements on the West Bank, who believe that they need to get rid of all of the Arabs in the area because this is what God led them to do. So the prime minister has to keep those people on side in order to maintain a. And if he can't keep a majority, then the government falls. They have to have new elections. They have to have a new coalition. So this led to the whole series. Most of us are old enough to remember most of these. All of those various Arab-Israeli wars that occurred in that particular area. The United States was partially involved in some, not involved at all in others. But we see all of those kinds of things going on in that area. Now, the causes of those wars. The primary cause is that number one up there, the conflicting claims to Palestine. We have Zionism on one side, and we have Arab nationalism on the other. Arab nationalism was this movement that arose in the 20th century, that Arabs are a nation among themselves, that they need to have control of the area. It was both a secular and a religious movement of these kinds of things, of trying to combine them all together. Of course, the establishment of Israel is probably the main reason why we have conflict in the area. Again, the Arabs in the area, most of the Muslims in the area believe that Israel doesn't belong there. That's their fundamental belief, that it doesn't belong there, that it is a European colony. That's their understanding of it. There are these territorial disputes. The West Bank that I've been talking about, it is under the occupation of the Israelis, but is largely a Palestine. There's an organization called the Palestine Administration, which controls it. Gaza, which originally was under this same organization, but eventually split off and now is run by Hamas. More on them later. And then we have the Golan Heights, which was at the following of one of those earlier wars, which is a piece of Syria that the Israelis captured and hold to this day as a security thing, which of course created this Palestinian refugee crisis. As a result of the 1948 war, a number of Palestinians who lived in what is now Israel were forcibly removed, told to leave, just picked up, go. Sometimes their property was bought, most of the time it was just not, and they left. In 1997, my ship pulled into Aqaba, Jordan. We were taking Marines in there to operate with the Jordanian army. I had a driver assigned to me who was a spy. He was spying on me. But he was also a member of one of the large Bedouin Arab Palestinian families who lived in the area. And eventually he took me out to the desert to meet his uncle. His uncle was a one-legged old man sitting in a tent out in the desert with this camp of Bedouins. He had fought in the 1948 war. That's where he lost his leg. He was sitting down in a tent. They were offering me this sickeningly sweet Arab tea, but of course you accept it. And he was telling stories about what happened. But the baseline of the story was he used to live in a town called Jenin, which is currently in Israel. His family were forcibly ejected. They now lived over in Jordan. And so here we were, 40 years after his ejection, 50 years after his ejection, and he still was dreaming of the day when they would go back to their land. Okay, that is referred to now as the right of return. Among the Palestinians, this term comes up over and over again. What is the right of return? We must have a right to return to the lands that we were forcibly removed from. So you can see right there we have a tremendous amount of conflict over who owns the land, the territorial disputes. So what has happened and what are the results of these various wars? We have significant territorial changes that have occurred very rapidly just in the 20th century. Just boom, 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 very, very quickly. Whereas prior to that, for a couple of millennia, things were relatively stable. Yes, there were changes, but it didn't happen as fast as it did in the 20th century. We have had some peace treaties, ones most specifically the Camp David Accords. Jimmy Carter convinced the Israelis and the Egyptians to come to a peace agreement, which has held for the most part until today. It's been standing in there just fine. The fact that you know it's holding is that even with the battles that's going on in Gaza right now, Egypt has stayed out of it. They're not getting involved in it. It also led to the rise of various militant groups. You have probably heard of the PLO, Hamas, Hezbollah, even the Houthis. Okay, who are those people? All right. The Palestinian Liberation Organization rose up in the 1980s and 1990s. Yasser Arafat, some of you may remember that name. These were Palestinians who had been forcibly ejected from the area, who wanted to go back, and in particular under Yasser Arafat, then were beginning this very militant, militaristic counterattacks of terrorist attacks, etc., in the area. That settled down a little bit, but the result was a number of others. Now, Hamas, which largely is in Gaza, grew out of an organization called the Muslim Brotherhood. In the Muslim Brotherhood, which formed up in the middle of the 20th century in Egypt, was a political party / militant group which was there at that particular time to overthrow the king of Egypt and establish an Egyptian control over the area. They were largely successful in that. The Muslim Brotherhood is still an active political party in Egypt. Later on, though, one particular group of the Muslim Brotherhood didn't think that the Muslim Brotherhood was extreme enough. This was Hamas. And they split off, and they largely set up in Gaza. Well, when the Palestinian Authority was established after the fall of the PLO over the West Bank and Gaza, Hamas set up control in Gaza and basically wrested control from that. So the West Bank and Gaza, while Palestinian entities, are separate. They're completely separate. Both Hamas then has as its founding, one of its founding rules is that they are there to destroy Israel, that Israel must go away, that that's the only way that they can achieve their right of return to the lands that they were kicked out of. Hezbollah. Hezbollah is another organization largely in southern Syria and southern Lebanon. They happen to be Shia, which is interesting. There are not that many Shia in the area, but they are a Shia organization, which led to connections with Iran, which set up for Iran to supply them. Iran eventually began supplying Hamas as well. Why? Not because they were Shia, but because they had a common enemy, which was Israel. More about that in a little bit. So the various Palestinian uprisings, resistance, the term they used was intifada, was there. These uprisings to protest Israel being in there led to intense international involvement, a lot of non-governmental organizations as well as governments, and then, of course, the various humanitarian concerns about what's going on with the people in the area. Now, about a minute here on oil. You can't talk about the Middle East if you don't talk about oil. The primary reason that Europeans care about the Middle East is oil. I mean, I don't think you can get very far away from that. Oil is the main reason why the Middle East matters. Oil was discovered in 1908 in Persia, now Iran, formed by the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, later to become British Petroleum. Now, it has this really neat name, Anglo-Persian Oil Company, but read British Petroleum. It was owned by the British. The Persians had little or no control on that. More about that later. By, oops, I went too fast. How do I get back? There it is. Okay. In 1927, they discovered oil in Iraq, British Petroleum there. In 1932, oil was discovered in Bahrain. That's that little island off of the east coast of Saudi Arabia. I've spent countless days and months there. By the Bahrain Petroleum Company, which was formed in Canada by Standard Oil. Standard Oil is an American oil company. And then later, Standard Oil managed to discover oil in Saudi Arabia. That 1938 discovery of oil in Saudi Arabia, which is one you're looking at the bottom there, is the beginning of the U.S. direct involvement with Saudi Arabia. And has been unchanged and unbroken since then. That was the connection in that one. OPEC was created by the Saudis in 1960. The Saudis became hugely rich. At that particular time in the 60s and in the 70s, it cost, oil was selling at about $25 a barrel, costing them about a nickel to 50 out of the ground. So the profit was just huge. So overnight, Saudis became this poor Arab state into this fabulously wealthy state because of that tremendous profit. It was basically we're pulling free oil out of the ground and selling it at this huge profit. So that's where the money came from. They don't have the same profit margin today, but it's when they came up with all that money back then, it's still around. It's still a lot of money. Now, Iran, we haven't talked much about her. It's an ancient civilization. Ancient, goes way back. We know about the Persian Empire. We read about it in the Bible. We read about it in a lot of other places. It's been there since at least 4000 BC, Cyrus the Great. Okay? It is not Arab. Many people, I mean, that's one of the misunderstandings that we in the West often have, is that everybody in the Middle East is an Arab. Okay, they're not. And does that matter? Yes, it matters. Ethnic identity matters to them. So they are largely, ethnically, they're Persian. Again, the demographics are at the bottom. There's various, they actually refer to themselves as Fars. The language is Farsi or Persian. There are a number of Azerbaijanis, Kurds, and the various others that live in there. It is a large country. I've overlaid it on the United States to give you a sense of how big it is. The population is, 84.9 million. It's a little bit less than a third of the U.S. population in an area that's, maybe a quarter of the size of the United States. So it's a huge country. It is a very large country. A good argument could be made is that Iran is, in fact, the superpower of the Middle East. Okay? Let's not talk about nuclear weapons or anything like that. It's just that it's a huge country. Its weakness, its only principal source of income is oil. Okay? That really matters. Now, Iran before 1979, largely westernized, not completely. It was ruled by the Shah. The Shah is basically the Farsi word for king. As you can see, here's some photographs that were taken in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. Kind of looks like a Western place. You can see women with hats sitting at a university. There's that street up there in the upper right-hand corner that probably could have been taken in New York. Here's some students on the campus in Tehran. That probably could have been taken up here at the University of Texas at about the same time. It would have looked about the same. Okay. What happened in Iran? As I say, Iran had been for years ruled by the Pahlavi family. The Shah, this is the last one, Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. He had been Shah from 1941 to 1979. But in the middle of that, in 1951, this fella on the right over here, Mossadegh, was selected as the prime minister of their parliament, of their legislature. He was very progressive at that particular time, and he began a series of social reforms. He nationalized the Anglo-Iranian oil company, which had been mostly owned by the British. He nationalized it. In other words, he took it from the British Obviously, the British weren't happy about that, slowly was taking over controls from the Shah. So the Shah was being weakened. The British, upset that the British Petroleum Company had been taken from them, Churchill, who had been re-elected as prime minister by that time in the early 50s of Great Britain, began lobbying President Eisenhower that we need to get rid of this Mossadegh guy and put the Shah back in control. Eisenhower initially resisted, but was eventually convinced, and then a combined CIA, MI6 operation. MI6 is the British CIA. They had a coup, overthrew Mossadegh, tossed him out, reestablished the Shah. Now, why does that matter? That is a major complaint by Iranians today against US and British interference in internal politics. You hear that all the time in the various statements that are made, either directly or they indirectly referred to, that, this was something, we were on our way to doing something good back then, and you guys blew it all up. Okay, so that's one of their major complaints. During the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, one of the leading protesters against this was a fellow named Ruhollah Khomeini, okay? He was eventually arrested and kicked out of the country. He ended up going to Paris and was there. But the underlying revolt was continuing to go on. And eventually in 1979, they had the Iranian Revolution, which overthrew the Shah. The Shah then was kicked out of the country, and the Iranian Revolution took over. During the process of this, and this was very interesting and has had an effect today, Khomeini did not create this new Iranian religious state he identified it more about what he was against than what he was for. He was for recreating a very upright Muslim purity state, but he also named the great Satan and the little Satan, Israel and the United States. The United States, the great Satan, Israel, the little. And the reason for that is that he saw the West in general, but the United States specifically, as the avenue whereby these impurities were coming into the country and destroying their pure culture and society. He created the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, which was a very heavily politicized militant group, military group, powerful politicized armed force. It includes terrorist support, this so-called Quds force. Sometimes you read that in the news. This is a special organization that goes out and supports the terrorist attacks in the rest of the world. He developed and supported those proxies, the ones that we've already talked about, Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis. All of that money going into there, aimed largely at Israel, but also subsequently at the United States. So the number one reason that why he was supporting those was because it posed a problem for Israel, hence a problem for the United States. Anything that causes a problem for the United States is good. That's the basic attitude that they have. Now, the U.S. has been involved there for a long time. I already talked to you about the oil discovery. At the end of World War II, the United States Navy left a force in the Persian Gulf, and it has progressed all the way through there. Like I said, from 1979 until I got out of the Navy, I was involved in all of that. Some of you in this room have been involved in some of those too. I know. You've been, I don't know if you could possibly have been in the American military during that time period and not be involved in some way, somehow. Now, what's been going on? Where are we now? In September of 20, the Abraham Accords were signed. It was between Israel and the United Arab Emirates. And then later on, some other countries were added. It was a basically normalization of relations between Israel and some of these Arab countries. That was very notable. The Saudis and Israelis had been involved in discussions leading to normalization. The Saudis desperately want to have normalized relations with Israel because it's just, the conflict is bad for business. I mean, that's really what it comes down to. This is the other one I say where nobody cares about the Palestinians. The Saudis could care less about what happens to the Palestinians. If the Palestinians just went away tomorrow, that would be fine as far as they're concerned. Okay, this is just kind of cold-blooded, but that's kind of the way things are over there. In many ways, they describe the Palestinians are the Jews of the Middle East. Nobody wants them around. It's a problem for everybody. We know about the more recent ones here. Then, of course, on 7 October 2023, Hamas attacked those Israeli settlements, took those hostages. Israel launched an attack. They attacked Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, basically reduced them to their military capabilities, and actually came to an agreement with them that Hezbollah would pull back away from Israel. So things have kind of settled down up there, all of which led them to the point where Israel felt that it was in a place where it could attack Iran. Because Hamas was largely neutralized because of what they've been doing in Gaza. I mean, that's a horrible building to building, blasting, killing lots of people, but basically their goal was to get rid of Hamas. And if they had to kill a bunch of Palestinians to do it, that's the price. Same thing with Hezbollah. They got them reduced and out of the way. Then they felt like they were in a place to be able to attack Iran. Right now, Israel probably has essentially complete control of Iranian airspace. They can do whatever they want. The attacks are still going on. They're not in the news very much, but there's still occasional attacks. They're still bombing in Gaza. And then, of course, we know on June 21st, the U.S. attacked those Iranian nuclear facilities. What is remarkable about that was that the Iranian retaliation on that was essentially nothing. Now, whether that stays the way it is, that remains to be seen. Now, remind you what we talked about today. This is that same slide that we saw earlier. This Israeli-Palestinian conflict, this Israeli-Iranian conflict, Israel is in the middle of the whole thing. It is easy to make a statement that the reason we have all this conflict is because Israel is where it is. I think that's probably true. Whether you think that's a good thing or a bad thing, I mean, that's the problem. That's the political problem, is what do we do with this and what's going to happen in the future. I've always said I am very pessimistic about the future in the Middle East. I don't see an easy resolution. I always said that the probable solution is easy but difficult to do. The solution is Israel needs to pull back from West Bank settlements, and the Palestinians have to give up the right of return. That would solve the problem. The problem is, that's a problem. Iran has not to attack U.S. interests. Well, okay, for now, we'll see. They've sworn they're going to keep going on nuclear development programs. I don't see that ending. I think they're strong enough to be able to do that. Whether that ends up in nuclear weapons or not remains to be seen, but I think nuclear power is where they're going. The main concern about whether the Iranians getting nuclear weapons is the Saudis. Now, the Saudis have no nuclear program, but the Saudis are rich enough to buy one, and there's plenty of sources for that. They can probably buy one from Pakistan. They could buy one from the Chinese. Now, probably not the Chinese, but there's a number of places where they could probably buy one. So I got a few minutes. I can answer a few questions, but if you've got questions on your card, I want you to leave them. If you'll just pass them to the inside and we'll pick them up. But I can take one or two questions. What do we got? Any? Yes, sir.
Don, can you talk a little bit about how Iran viewed Israelis prior to Revolution 79?
They were pretty much an ally. Israel and Iran under the Shah were largely allies. There was a lot of trade going on between the two, and there was no particular conflict going on. It was only after the Iranian Revolution with this idea that the West was polluting the pure Muslim society within there that led to that. So that Iranian-Israeli thing is not a long-standing historical conflict. Yes.
I'm assuming there couldn't have been a revolution in Iran without popular support.
Correct.
And so that ally that you're talking about was not really popular support. Is there still popular support for theocracy in Iran?
There is, but the primary reason that the revolution succeeded was not that they wanted to create this theocracy. It was that the Shah was a very repressive ruler. He had the typical secret police that a lot of those authoritarian governments had, and so he was seen as a bad guy. And then we got Khomeini comes in and he generates the theocratic support, but is also supported by those who said the Shah is a bad guy. And then he took over. So you still see bits of there's a lot of support for overthrowing the current Ayatollah, who's Khamenei, not Khomeini. It's a little confusing, but there is support for that. Those are those folks who remember their parents where things were a little bit more westernized, and they really like that idea. In fact, one of the ways that the young women protest is they're all required to wear the hijab, the headscarf, but the way they protest is they just push it further and further and further back on their head. Okay, and so you'll see that the very traditional wears it clear up here, but you'll watch them start to push that scarf back, exposing just a little bit more hair as a kind of an unspoken protest. So both sides are still there, and it's still going. The question is there enough of this other uprising to bring about, something against the Khomeini, the Ayatollahs? I don't, that remains to be seen. Yes, ma'am.
Do you think we have an increased danger of a suicide type attack or like a regular attack here because of the bombing of Iran?
Probably not on the scale of 9/11. I don't think that would happen. It's entirely possible that, you're going to have individuals do things. Whether it's, the highly organized ones, I think, are not likely. I would never say it's impossible, but probably not likely. But the idea of small onesies and twosies getting it in their head that this is a good idea to do is entirely possible. In fact, the London bombings in July of '07 on their underground tubes was basically a group of a handful of Middle Eastern guys who were largely British citizens who just came up with this was a good idea to go out and do it. It was not really, they had some training back in the Middle East, but it wasn't really an Iranian-supported evolution. So those kind of things are entirely possible. One more.
Yeah, would you speak to this question that there is tremendous amount of money in war,
Yeah,
and it's the best money laundering we've ever come up with.
yeah, yeah.
We just send money over there and it comes back under the table. Now, to what extent do you think that's, because as you point out, it's an easy solution. And rational people will go for a rational solution. But the solution is, let's keep the money going. So could you speak to the effect on the money laundering aspect of this as keeping the war going, and that's why it's going?
I think that is an overstatement, but it's certainly part of the question about it. Once the business aspect gets going, it's hard to turn that down. And then when you get folks saying, well, this is all in defense of the country and national defense, and how can you say we're going to knock down national defense? I don't believe that there is a conspiracy to keep that going, but the fact that money speaks, and putting money into military is an easy solution for that kind of thing. That's the most I can say about it. I reject the conspiracy part of it, but a lot of money does go into it. And one of the things that happened over there, I know, is we do put a lot of money in there for, out and out bribery. There's no question about that. That's how we solved a lot of problems in the Middle East. We just bribe them to do things that we want. You can put different words on it, but that's kind of what it comes down to. And then handing over military equipment to whether it's the Israelis or whether it's anybody else is relatively easy, and it doesn't cost us very many lives. We can just hand stuff over. So it's a relatively easy solution. Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't work. Maybe one more?
It looks like Israel is trying to destroy Gaza.
Yeah.
And the humanitarian aspect of it is real
Yeah. I'll end on this. Warfare, particularly modern warfare, is tremendously destructive. We have industrialized killing. We know how to do that now. We learned that over the last century. And one of the things that we have tried to do that has been happening is the use of steel over lives. And that is a one-sided proposition. I'm going to use steel against you to protect me and my people, but I don't care what happens to you. So that's kind of what's going on. If you look at most of the warfare, and those of you who have been involved in it over the last years kind of know that war is extremely destructive, and it's gotten even more destructive. And when you have a very crowded area like Gaza, to go after and attack the Hamas militants, you really cannot not kill people who are not involved. It's a sad statement. That's just the fact of what's going on. There's some very hard-hearted, steely-eyed people that make those decisions and happen. Americans have done this in the past, and we're not just saying the Israelis. One of the things that, these suicide attacks, somebody was interviewing some suicide bombers that they had captured and all. And the rule was, okay, you guys have F-16s, we have suicide bombers. This is how we go tit for tat, because I don't have what you've got. This is how we do these things. And then again, we're living in an area, that area over there is the land of endless revenge. Okay, so I bumped into you, so you're going to carry out revenge on me for having bumped into me, for you, and then your cousin sees what's happening and he bumps into you, and then we just keep doing this, and nobody remembers how it got started anymore. It's endless revenge, and that's what I'm most afraid of in the Middle East. And we're going to end it there. And again, if I can have all those cards, we'll come up with something, and I know Pastor Stephen needs to get going with the next worship service here, but thank you for your time.